Welcome back. Well, we've been focused on water scarcity and shortages since yesterday, but what about the quality of water we do have? It can all be affected by urbanisation, deforestation, industry, as well as pollution. Let's get more from the Green Connection's Liziwe McDaid. Liziwe, good morning and thank you very much for your time. You know, as important as water is, I must say many are nonchalant about environmental issues. If nothing else, the day zero crisis as a result of drought and the recent floods are probably the only two climate events that have forced some sort of a conversation around climate change in most households. Why is this?
I think the problem is that climate change doesn't come suddenly, and it's been creeping up, if I want to call it that, for the last 20 or more years. But in South Africa, we've started to see these changes. So it's only when you faced personally in your own life with no water coming out the tap, or being flooded, your town being flooded, that you start to realize, okay, maybe there's a link between this big global phenomenon and my own life. And I think what we haven't got our heads around is the world is changing and we need to adapt. So although the day zero shows us there's a problem with water quality, with water quantity, it doesn't mean that we can just look for more water and use it as wastefully as we have. And if you think about things like acid mine drainage, you think about the way that people will pump boreholes and then they just use that water to spray over their gardens, or at midday over the sports fields. I'm sure we've all seen that. So that water is being wasted, and that's an attitude that we have to change. So it's both an issue of water, how much water we use, and what we use it for, but it's also about making sure that we don't create another disaster in the future with polluted water. We also have that problem here.
I do want us to delve deeper into water conservation as to what we can do individually in our homes and communities. But first I want to tackle the issue itself. That if we're seeing rivers and lakes drying up and our taps drying up, can we purely attribute this to climate change, or rapid urbanization, which really speaks to poor planning in most municipalities, could also be a factor in this, including mismanagement as well?
It's a huge factor. If you think about the way that we urbanize, we create these concrete jungles. We put roads, we put drains, and then we put houses, and then we pave those houses. So what you're basically doing is preventing water that is coming out the sky, which you could be gathering. You're preventing it from going into the soil, feeding the soil, and filling up those subterranean water reservoirs. And it all just rushes off down to the sea. And when it rushes off down to the sea, it ends up flooding some areas. It gets polluted along the way. And what you have is a worsening problem. Whereas if you urbanize in a way that was adaptive to water conservation, every house, it would be mandatory to have a water tank, which you would use for your garden, your vegetable patch. You wouldn't be allowed to pave your driveways with impermeable paving. Gutters should be there to simply feed water off into ponds with wetland type of vegetation, which can also be adapted to parks for people to play in. So the ways of actually managing urbanization and doing proper planning will enable us to cope with a climate that changes as we go forward. But if we just carry on doing what we've done before, we get ourselves into more trouble.
So clearly leadership is probably at the heart of it. That if you have bad leadership, you will see situations such as the day zero that we're now speaking of in Gqeberha. And if we have good leadership, we'll see perhaps what happened in the city of Cape Town, where they averted the crisis. Yes, they had it, but nevertheless, they managed to come out of it better off. And now they have certain mechanisms to conserve water. But talk to us about the different kinds of pollution, because most people just think of untreated waste that flows into these rivers. But we also have agriculture playing a great role, be it in the form of pesticides, etc. Talk to us about this.
So when you think about, if you remember what happened in eThekwini, in Durban, where the river, the floods, there was a whole lot of, suddenly there was blue and red water in the river because the dyes, chemical dyes from factories ended up in that water. So that's the kind of thing is, if you use water in your chemical processes, you must take the water upstream. You must take your water in for your factory upstream from where you released it. Sorry, downstream. So you make sure that your water is clean when you put it in. You know, like those are simple rules that the municipality can put in place. I think it is about leadership, but it's also about people changing their behavior longer term. So the city of Cape Town saved water short term and then reverted back. So, and then the other thing we need to think of is E. coli is everywhere because we don't have good sewage systems. So there is waste in the water. But we also need to think about things like hormones. Women on the pill, the amount of hormones that animals are fed that end up inside us because we eat them. So those hormones, we then end up also in our water systems. And those can also have impacts both on the natural environment and on humans. So these are other pollutants that we don't think of. Then we have acid mine drainage, you know, from the mines. That also is something that needs to be rehabilitated. So you don't just, the pollution is not just pollution. And then, as you said, there's pesticides, runoff, and fertilizers is another big one. So fertilizers is what happens. You get a whole lot of fertilizers in the water, and then you end up with it causes a big feeding frenzy for plants. And then you have this pile of plants all over the water, which then can smother the river, which means there's no fish, and that leads to more pollution problems. So there's a lot of different types of pollution that we need to think about how we change what we can do it through what we buy, and we can also call on our municipalities to put proper rules in place.
Ms. McDaid, thank you very much for your time. That's Liziwe McDaid from Green Connections. So this